For our last general session, we've got a real treat for you because we have what I'll dub an American success story. For those of you who understand some things around flagging here in the United States, or registering here in the United States, tonnage requirements and the like, we've always been at a bit of a competitive disadvantage relative to other flag states. And it used to be you literally, and I mean literally, had to get an act of Congress to circumvent it, get an exception. We had a situation with the Motor Yacht Freedom just recently breaking through that glass ceiling, if you will, and actually getting authorization from the U.S. Coast Guard. They're above 300 gross tons to flag U.S. without an act of Congress. And that's all I'm going to say because Corey Ranslam here, I'm going to introduce who's going to moderate the session, but I just wanted to let you know what the session is about because we're very excited about this, and we hope, basis of some conversation 3 weeks ago in Washington, that while maybe not a precedent, is certainly the first of what we hope will be a number of boats that can also flag in the United States without an act of Congress. Corey's, first of all, a good friend, so it's easy for me to acknowledge him and what he does. He's currently the president of Suncoast Holdings Corporation, which owns a number of companies, including a maritime security company, maritime security software development company that he's been working on very hard, I know, for some time. He started Suncoast after he was the CEO of Secure Waters, which he ran for 8 years. Corey spent 8 years in the Coast Guard, so he knows his stuff. He's worked on various law enforcement and port security-related missions, South Florida, Central and South America, and the Caribbean. So he comes with a lot of experience. After the Coast Guard, Corey worked at Smith Detection for 4 years in a role as manager, project manager, and region manager of the federal government operations. He spent an awful lot of hours in his life working worldwide on security-related projects. And I want to say what he's done for the U.S. Superyacht Association, because for the last several years, he's been our chair for the regulatory part of advocacy. And Corey has been back and forth to Washington to visit the State Department, Customs and Border Protection, as well as the U.S. Coast Guard on behalf of everyone in the room here, and has gotten an awful lot done with those three regulatory agencies, particularly from an entering the U.S. waters standpoint. And I just want to thank him for that as I introduce him, and he'll take over this exciting final general session. Thanks, Corey.
Thank you, my only fan. That's Donna Bradbury in the back. I'll give you $20 at the cocktail reception later on. Thank you. You always got to have a plant somewhere in the room, you know, to be like, wow, great speakers up there today. But it's definitely not about me. Thank you for the introduction, John. I've really enjoyed the last 7 years that I've been able to represent the association on the board of directors and being part of the advocacy team and really concentrating on the regulatory side. About 2 years ago at the Fort Lauderdale Boat Show, there was a few of us who got together to start to have a conversation about how do we bring more boats to the United States. And it's a conversation that we have constantly on the executive committee and the board level of the U.S. Superyacht Association. By bringing more boats to the United States, that in turn means more business for our member businesses. And one of the items that we started to discuss was the issues of flagging boats with an American flag and the onerous set of regulations, outdated set of regulations that were in place. So 2 years ago, we started to look at this, at the tonnage requirements, at the crew and the manning requirements, and a whole bunch of different areas to see how we could start to chip away and make some changes to these regulations. And through this process, these folks were involved in reflagging a boat that was over 300 gross tons from Cayman Islands to the American flag, and it was kind of a neat intersection between what they were doing and what we were trying to do within the U.S. Superyacht Association, and it was a pretty interesting intersection that happened a few months ago. So we thought as part of the summit, it would be great to have a general session on what these guys did, what happened, and kind of then at the end we'll talk a little bit about the path forward and some of the things that we're now doing as part of the U.S. Superyacht Association to build on what these folks have done. And we have 3 great panelists here today, very knowledgeable. We were going to have 4, but unfortunately the captain of Motor Yacht Freedom could not be here at the last minute. There were some issues on board the boat today, so he could not be here at the last minute, so I apologize. But these guys are really the core of the knowledge group that went through this whole process over about 14 months. And they're willing to take very hard and difficult questions, too, so feel free to throw out difficult questions to them. And I'll introduce each one, but I'll let them go into their background and how they were involved, because each one of them plays a very unique role. We have Drew Haynes from Murray & Associates, naval architect. We have Katie Tulip from Water's Edge Consulting, and Paul Bates from the U.S. Coast Guard. So like I said, we have a really good group of people here today to kind of shed light on, in about 45 minutes of a 14-month process. So this is a very condensed Reader's Digest version of what took place over 14 months. So I'll start out with you, Drew.
Well, probably about 2 years ago, a gentleman who owned a U.S. flag yacht wanted to buy a bigger yacht, and he's an American, and he wanted a U.S. flag. He wanted a U.S. flag on his yacht, and I'll turn my microphone on now. Is that better?
There you go.
Okay. And his broker came to our company and said, look, I understand that if the yacht's under 300 tons measured in the U.S. system, then I can do this. But if it's over 300 tons, I'm told I can't do this. But my wife and I, we really want to buy this yacht. So we looked at it and we did everything we could to use the tonnage system that exists, the national tonnage system, to manipulate the tonnage below 300. Unfortunately, even modifying the boat, sensible modifications, we couldn't make it happen. So the owner said, well, what are my other options? And one of the other options is go get a congressman or a senator, and you can get an act of Congress. There are several acts of Congress that declare very large motor yachts, recreational vessels under 300 tons, and no inspection. The other path, which was taken in this case, was to go head-to-head with the U.S. Coast Guard and obtain a U.S. Coast Guard certificate of inspection, which is what's required for a U.S. flag motor yacht, even a recreational vessel over 300 tons. My role in the whole process was working with the captain, and I literally wrote most of the correspondence to the U.S. Coast Guard and asking for the equivalencies and dealing with all of the various regulations in 46 CFR Subchapter I and Subchapter S to make it happen. The first thing we did was fill out an application for inspection, and when we did that, we met on board with Paul Bates from the U.S. Coast Guard. Paul, do you want to talk a little bit about the first meeting on board and how that went about?
That was an interesting meeting. We've done some research since the Freedom's been certificated, and I think this is the first yacht over 300 tons to be certificated by the Coast Guard. At least researching through our database, there may have been some certified before and there's some exemptions or something, but I think this is the first one. My job in the whole thing was easy. I looked at Mr. Haynes and said, you know, you need to meet Subchapter I. Well, Subchapter I is written for 1,200-foot container ships. It's written for bulk grain carriers. It's freight vessel regulations. And he looked at me and says, oh, it does meet Subchapter I. So, you know, I basically said, well, you got to prove it and submit plans. So the boat's already got a whole set of plans all drawn up under the Cayman flags and the LY2 code. So he's got all these plans drawn up, and I said, those are good, but do those meet Subchapter I? And he didn't have that answer. So that's when the whole process started of trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. Luckily, the owner was very patient, because that's who I deal with. I deal with the owner. It's the owner's responsibility to present the vessel to the Coast Guard in compliance. The owner was good enough to hire people who understood what section modulus meant, what STCW meant, what NTRP meant, and all the different acronyms we work with. If you did this without help, it would not be possible, I don't think. The owners just don't understand the process they need to go through. And they don't understand, why is the Coast Guard inspecting a vessel that's recreational? And that's difficult to explain. We can't explain to him why a $30 million yacht is not safe to go to sea in the Coast Guard's view. The owners don't understand that either. But basically, the law was passed, the regulations were developed, and that's what I have to go by. I don't have a magic wand where I can exempt a vessel from an extra fire station or a lifeboat or structural fire protection or any of these issues that came up. And that's where these two people went to work developing, okay, how does this round peg fit into a square hole?
Can I ask you to go back a half a step? This is a Cayman Island flag yacht that was built where?
In the United States.
Built in the United States.
A Northern Marine.
What foreign flag, and it's 498 tons?
498 tons ITC, and our calculations showed approximately the tonnage would have been 330 tons measured under the U.S. regulatory system.
But it's a foreign flag vessel that wants to come back to the United States.
Correct.
Thank you.
Correct. She's an ABS class motor yacht too, and the fact that she was an ABS class motor yacht played a large role in what we did. We took all the plans that were on board and more or less said, here you go, U.S. Coast Guard, review them at the Marine Safety Center, and you tell us where we don't meet Subchapter I, but we've got all the plans. And each time we sent in the plans, we looked at the plans and said, okay, this doesn't meet, but we have an equivalency here. In the end, the Marine Safety Center at the Coast Guard really wasn't very interested in the actual plans for this vessel. What they really wanted from us was what the Coast Guard likes to call a gap analysis. In my office, a couple of engineers in my office took all the plans for this motor yacht that were provided by the builder, and the Subchapter I and the other Coast Guard regulations in S and Marine Engineering's in one of the other subchapters, and compared the actual yacht as constructed and on the plans to those regulations, and we wrote this report. They called it a gap analysis. And what we determined was that there were actually very few gaps between the way the motor yacht Freedom was built as an ABS class motor yacht that was also built to LY2 to the actual requirements in Subchapter I. That gap analysis went to Paul's office and to Paul's boss, and then it went from Paul's boss to what they call District 7, which is also in Miami, and then it went to the Marine Safety Center in Washington, and then it went from the Marine Safety Center to the Office of Commercial Vessel Compliance, which is the office that finally, after about 12 months of doing all this, wrote us a letter that said that Subchapter I, that the ABS rules in conjunction with the MCA code, LY2, were, don't quote me exactly on this, substantially equivalent to the corresponding requirements of Subchapter I. And when we got that final letter, that's when we picked up the phone and called Paul and said, time to come out to the boat and do an inspection. And while we were on board doing the inspection, of course, there's a lot of manning issues, bridge paperwork issues, certificate issues, and things that are, some of them unique to the U.S. flag, and that's where Katie came in. When Paul did his initial inspection, Katie and I, along with a gentleman from ABS, were there, and Paul gave us a work list. They call it an 835, which was all the things that he found during the inspection that we didn't have. There were there were no physical modifications to the vessel required, but we did have to put the yacht's name on some life jackets and a couple of minor things, and go through some paperwork exercises to make sure we had proper stuff for the manning, for the crew. And Katie can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so Freedom, as a over 400-ton vessel under the Cayman flag, was required to have a mini ISM safety management system on board, and they had theirs with us at Water's Edge Consulting. So I was already overseeing them a few months prior to this process, getting their Cayman certificates surveyed and renewed and such. So we oversaw anything from their safety management system to their life-saving appliances to their oil pollution certificates, class certificates, flag certificates, their oil pollution plans and prevention, garbage management plans, and things along those lines, which, once it was to switch to the U.S. flag, were pretty similar. So we then had to take all of those plans that were under a Cayman flag and put them under a U.S. flag. However, the U.S. was thinking, we don't do that because this is just a recreational vessel. So a lot of regulations were coming out on my end that we had never seen, and we had to change within our plans and get certificates reissued, resubmit plans for approval, and get their manning met, and oversee probably about 25 of their certificates changed, all different radio surveys, everything along those lines from flag and class that we take care of for Cayman, we had to switch over to U.S. So,
To expand on your comment and make sure things are clear, the Coastwise Trade laws don't apply to the Freedom. So where it was built is irrelevant. It could have been built in Caymans or Europe or anywhere. The vessel certificate of inspection is issued to her as a recreational vessel. Okay, she's restricted to recreational from here on out. She can't do commercial trade.
When she was under Cayman, how was she operating under the Cayman flag?
private,
Commercial vessel or private vessel?
private.
Private.
Right, but she did comply with LY2 and did have a Cayman-issued load line. And actually, one of the things that's still outstanding with the Motor Yacht Freedom, she's a U.S. flag yacht. As a U.S. flag recreational vessel, the load line convention doesn't apply. Most of you that work in the yachting business who deal with commercial motor yachts will see those plimsoll marks on the side of the boat. Well, as a recreational vessel in the U.S. flag, you do not need to have a load line. However, the vessel had a load line. So the captain said, when we were done with the reflagging, hey, can I keep my load line? We still have a request pending with the U.S. Coast Guard for a voluntary load line. The interesting thing about that is the U.S. regulations for a load line are the exact regulations for a load line on a cargo ship. They do not include any of the relaxations that are in LY2 or in any of the other popular yacht flag codes. And so the U.S. says the vessel does not comply with the load line convention. You cannot have a load line certificate, we've asked them to use LY2 as an equivalency to the U.S. interpretations of the load line convention, and that aspect has been pending for the last 90 days. The Coast Guard does not respond rapidly to requests sometimes.
The question, just because it's been talked about a lot, and I think the way I've always heard the position was that the reason why they could not switch back to U.S. was the 300 gross ton number. So, but what I'm hearing today is it's really not tied into the 300. It's really not tied into the 300 gross ton. It sounds to me like it was more tied into just the procedures of getting it back. So that's question number one. And then two, if it would have gone, if it's not tied into the 300 gross ton, and if it had been U.S. to begin with, then it obviously would not have been an issue. So I guess my question is twofold. One, when it was first built, would there have been any reason why it couldn't have been flagged U.S. under the way it was built? And is the reason why it became so complicated strictly because it went out, became Cayman, now wanted to come back U.S.? Because the way I hear it talked about in the community a lot, it's tied back into the 300 gross ton a lot. So I want to clarify that.
You're absolutely correct. The 300-ton threshold is a significant threshold. What a lot of yacht builders do in this country is they purpose build the yacht to be below 300 tons as measured under the U.S. regulatory tonnage system. You'll hear builders put things called tonnage doors in, or you'll hear tonnage frames, or other tonnage reduction techniques. There's a whole cottage industry in this country that does nothing more than make yachts and certain commercial craft, it's typical in tugs as well, lower in tonnage than it would be using this system. So if the owner was to buy an existing, if the owner was to build a new motor yacht, he could simply say to his builder, hey, build it under 300 tons, and then we don't have any of these problems. This is the case where the yacht was not built to beat these tonnage regulations, and therefore could not be made under 300, so we had to comply with the regulations for a yacht over 300 tons.
And so it has nothing to do with the legality of a 300 ton. It's the process that if it is over 300, that makes it so complicated.
Exactly.
In
Right,
layman's
because-
terms, with all the different codes that we went
Correct.
through. But just
Correct.
strictly, okay.
We-
Thank you.
It wouldn't have taken 14 months, and the owner wouldn't have needed my services to have reflagged the yacht if it was below 300 tons. It would have been an administrative process.
National tonnage.
He could have
National tonnage.
shaved 6 inches off his staircase and been under 300 tons.
Right.
All they had to do was shave 6 inches off the staircase.
What we determined was the only way to reduce the U.S. regulatory tonnage, also called the national tonnage of the boat, would have been to move the main staircase in the boat, which is obviously not a practical modification.
And a lot of times, a vessel doesn't want to become inspected. They don't want to go through the inspection process, they don't want to get the certificate, but really that's the easiest way to go because an act of Congress is an act of Congress, and that's not easy. And the reducing the tonnage, if you were to either take out the staircase or perhaps put in the tonnage doors, it's a $100,000 project. So
So the yacht as it is today is over 300 actual tonnage?
Yes.
Yes.
yes,
Okay, so that backs up against, this bumps up against the whole issue of not being able to reflag into the U.S. flag a yacht over 300 tons that has left and now wants to come back. The ceiling is 300 tons. Is that correct?
no, they just have to get inspected.
If you're below 300 tons, you're not subject to inspection.
But since
If you're
you're-
above 300, you are subject to inspection.
I thought the only way you can come back over 300 tons was an act of Congress.
No.
No.
That's what we're
So-
that's what we're saying.
That's the
Gene-
big misconception, and that's the whole reason why we put this this whole panel together because of the process that these guys went
But
through.
hasn't that been the past practice?
No. You've always been, you just have to get inspected if you're over 300 tons.
So if you see this slide here, the requirement for inspection is stated in the U.S. law. Motor-propelled vessels of at least 300 tons making voyages beyond the boundary line are subject to inspection under U.S. Code 3301. Such vessels shall be inspected under Subchapter I. What 3301 is a bunch of definitions, and it defines a
Yeah.
it defines a ocean-going vessel as an inspected vessel.
A question for Paul on this. Is that limited to U.S. flag, or is that any vessel?
That's any vessel. Even foreign flag vessels are subject to that law.
Thank you.
Ken, you had a question in the back? Yeah, it might be a slightly dumb question. There's no dumb questions,
No.
Ken.
Thanks. You talk about the Coast Guard inspection as if it's something different to maybe somebody else's flag state inspection. Are there some principal points of difference that make it a much more onerous inspection, or is it just being inspected at all that is the problem?
Well, I think that the thing that's unique about Freedom is that this may be the only inspected U.S. flag recreational motor yacht. In other words, most U.S. flag yachts are purpose-built below 300 tons to avoid inspection. I would not say that the inspection process is any more difficult than the inspection process that you would go through with a Cayman flag or any of the other flags. It's just unique in that I guess it happens less. It's not commonplace. This is obviously the first motor yacht that Paul's team in Miami has ever inspected.
Yeah, I think Katie can talk to, I think we were talking about some savings to the owner. The Coast Guard's free. Our inspection is free. The taxpayers pay for it. You have to pay an annual user fee, but it's quite low. And Katie can talk to.
Well, and further, it's actually, because mostly what I do at Water's Edge is with foreign flag, and going through the inspection process with Subchapter I, it is very similar. There really isn't much of a difference. It's quite amazing how similar it is, which could have something to do with the gap analysis, but either way, it was amazing how similar they were. And typically, even a private yacht under a Cayman flag doesn't want an inspection or a surveyor to come out on board and go through everything with them. But Freedom decided as well to have compliance as close to a commercial yacht as possible. So they also were already set up to comply commercially, so that made their inspection go pretty smoothly, and they met Subchapter I without many problems, actually. So it was very similar.
And a lot of the, I want to call them miscellaneous certificates that are required on board, your IOPP certificate, your IAPP certificate, and those kinds of things that are driven by, those are driven by MARPOL. They apply to recreational vessels, commercial vessels, so you've got to have those inspections and certificates on board regardless. So those are, either the ABS surveyor does them, or somebody from the Coast Guard does them, or somebody from the Cayman Islands does them, but they're pretty uniformly standard inspections.
Right here?
Yeah, my question was is it, I'm hearing that perhaps the U.S. inspection was more commercial cargo, bulk carrier oriented, and that the Cayman Islands inspections are more yacht friendly and more that's what they do. More of those inspections are of yachts.
Well-
Is that part of what?
The
What's given
Cayman
the Americans, what's given the U.S. inspection such a bad rap in the industry? And everybody here thinks it's some hideous thing.
It's not hideous. It's just not done that often. Everybody's used to doing the inspections with the Cayman flag. I don't think that in the course of of the Motor Yacht Freedom operating that we're going to see the captain and the crew on board complain about their annual inspection process. I think it's going to be pretty similar. In fact, it's probably going to be cheaper for them.
And the Coast Guard was pretty impressed, weren't you, when they were going through their drills and their safety equipment? They went on board the yacht and thought, wow.
The inspection process was pretty easy. Now, don't get confused, this was not built to Cayman flags, it was built to the LY2 code. And that's a standard similar to Subchapter I. In a lot of ways, the LY2 code was a lot more stringent than Subchapter I, which helped us in granting some equivalencies. Subchapter I requires no structural fire protection, 0 for vessels under 4,000 tons, where the LY2 code addresses it around the engine room and the galley, which are common sense things. Subchapter I doesn't address it because you're talking about engine rooms on container ships, not on fiberglass boats. Subchapter I deals with steel, not fiberglass. So the LY2 code was developed for yachts built to fiberglass, and they address those issues that Subchapter I didn't. And as more yachts come in, I think the Coast Guard will look to what it does is it can incorporate other standards, ASME, ASTM. They'll incorporate IEEE or ABYC. You guys are familiar with. They'll incorporate those regulations into, and that will allow us to verify the vessels in compliance with LY2 and issue a certificate based on that versus Subchapter I.
Billy, you had a question?
Yeah, were there any waivers in this process? Did the Coast Guard grant waivers?
Just right now, you're looking.
No,
No.
there were no exemptions issued at all. So the OCMI can grant what's called equivalent levels of safety. And I think Subchapter I required 2 fire stations and Freedom only had 1. But there were some other issues.
I don't, on the plan review level, the only thing that was reviewed by the U.S. Coast Guard Marine Safety Center, their plan review group, if you will, it used to be in Washington, now it's in Virginia somewhere, was the stability. There's a passenger crowding stability criteria that's not in LY2, that's in 46 CFR Subchapter S, and we did those calcs and submitted them to the Marine Safety Center, and they reviewed them, and that was the end of it. That was really the only additional piece of engineering work that my office did to make this happen. And except for anything that Paul did on the local level, there were no exemptions, no equivalencies, other than the blanket equivalency of LY2 plus ABS, a Motor Pleasure Yacht Guide, is equivalent to Subchapter I. And that letter that says that, written by the Office of Commercial Vessel Compliance, says the Motor Yacht Freedom and other similar motor yachts.
Is that letter publicly available?
Since it was issued by the U.S. Coast Guard, I think it's something that a good lawyer could get their hands on via Freedom of Information Act request. So if you want a copy, just ask me for it.
I have a copy too, up here. I traveled to the Coast Guard 3 weeks ago, and I took a couple of things.
But-
So, you know what?
There,
But there's a question over here, Jeff.
Can you hold on a second?
thank you.
They're bringing the microphone around.
I was going to say, the first thing is, I just wanted to congratulate you guys on a job well done. That's fantastic. And
Thank you.
it's nice to see more boats with a U.S. flag on it and some of the complexities away from it. And with that, a couple questions. Was this, if this boat had never gone Cayman, would it have still had to go through the exact same process?
If it operates beyond the boundary line, yes.
Okay.
Well, yeah, it would have something would have had to happen during the build, either purpose-built below 300 or inspection during construction.
Right. Okay, so the next question is this boat a fiberglass boat? I wasn't clear on that.
Yes, this is a fiberglass motor yacht.
Okay. And then the last question is, now that you've done this once, would it be faster, easier, less expensive? Was the learning curve relatively steep and now evened off any?
If a client approached me today and asked me to do the same thing with an ABS class fiberglass, steel, or aluminum motor yacht, and it was going to be in Miami, we could shave the amount of time that it took to do and the cost probably in half compared to what we went through. The client paid my office to write an enormous amount of letters and emails to the Office of Commercial Vessel Compliance, citing regulation, reading regulation, interpreting regulation, and arguing with the various individuals at the Coast Guard Commercial Vessel Compliance on a regular basis to make this happen. And the path that's paved now would make it much smoother to do it on another motor yacht. If you were to do it with another class, say an LR boat or a D&V GL boat or a BV boat, it would be a similar process, but it may take a little bit more effort than that. In any case, I suspect that the U.S. Coast Guard will want a gap analysis for each individual yacht. So you would need to engage somebody like my office to write that gap analysis.
One of the things, if I could add to that, this kind of tails into what we started a couple of years ago with the USSA. And about 3 weeks ago, we had a meeting in D.C. with the office in the Coast Guard, civil and active duty, who handled a lot of what happened with Motor Yacht Freedom, just because we were interested from an association standpoint of how can we take what these folks have worked on and what they've done and use that as a foundation to be able to move forward to standardize this process across the Coast Guard. There's still a lot of things that, even after Motor Yacht Freedom at Coast Guard headquarters, that they still don't have processes in place to be able to handle this, you know, to say, okay, there's 100 yachts that you need to do. We're now on a kind of a strategic level. The Coast Guard has said that they want to build a committee between industry and Coast Guard to be able to look at this gap analysis across the board. So you can look at other class standards and other issues that need to be addressed. This is just scratching the surface on some of the high-level issues. There's a lot of other issues that have been identified through this process that need to be addressed and need to be looked at, and things that we've talked about a number of times internally in USSA. And now the Coast Guard, with the success of Freedom and what's happened, has opened the door to say, okay, we want to sit down now with the industry to start to have this discussion to standardize this process across the board of what was done within Motor Yacht Freedom. So there's a lot of work from an industry standpoint now, working with Coast Guard to be able to push forward and make this happen. So that was a pretty exciting meeting for us, that they said we're willing to be able to talk now to industry to see what we can do to standardize this whole process.
You don't have a picture of it with the new flag on it?
I actually do, just not in the slide.
It's not in the slides. Well, I can put my picture back up if you want. That's,
Gene, another
Yeah, I had
question?
another question. I was curious on the tonnage. Did I understand correctly that she's now operating under a national tonnage certificate?
No, because there was no advantage of having her re-ed measured, we never bothered to actually get assigned a U.S. regulatory or national tonnage at 330 for the boat. You don't have to have a U.S. regulatory or national tonnage on a yacht like this. You only need the ITC.
She's an ITC 490 something.
498, Gene.
All right, so she's full MARPOL.
Correct. And MARPOL is based upon ITC anyhow, not national tonnage.
Right.
So you still need the IOPP, the IAPPs, and all that other alphabet soup of MARPOL.
Yeah.
There's going to be a test later on all these acronyms.
I just have one final question, and I will be quiet. Why did the owner want to buy this boat and go through all this trouble? Because he's a patriot and he wanted to have a U.S. flag on this particular boat and to hell with all these expenses and problems he had?
Well, he definitely wanted a U.S. flag. He definitely is a patriot. We told him, like, look, you could buy another boat. You could buy a boat that has tonnage openings. You could even buy a foreign flag boat that was built with tonnage openings. There are a couple of yacht builders that build their yachts with tonnage openings just in case the yacht might want to reflag. In this case, for whatever reason, the owner and his wife wanted this particular vessel and said he was willing to roll the dice and spend the money. And as much as we say that this was a 14-month process, in the grand scheme of the way expenses go on a motor yacht this size, it really wasn't that expensive.
There's some backstory to this that's pretty funny, and I don't want to give away who the owner is, but where the owner was taking the boat, I don't think it would have been well received having a Cayman Islands flag on the back of this thing, so
He's
we
a good
kind
old
of
boy.
joked about that. He's a good old boy.
He's a good old boy
He's a
from
good old boy.
Alabama.
Yeah.
And he used it when it was foreign flagged. You have to do notice of arrivals and departures every single port you go to in the U.S. as a foreign flag vessel. And he would go to a different port every day, way up in the bayous of Alabama. And every day we'd have to enter a notice of arrival and departure. We didn't even know where these places were. We couldn't even pronounce the name, and here we are. So he says, well, if I have a U.S. flag on here, I don't have to do those, and I don't have to get yelled at by my Southerners that I have a foreign flag on the back of this boat, and I'm American. And
Bobby, I like your new boat, but I don't like that flag back there.
yeah.
We have a question over here.
I had a question, although it might not apply to this owner particularly, but in general, would it be possible under the regs to have a non-American crew member employed on the vessel?
Crew members, yes.
Watch officers, no. I think it was
Well,
50%.
the captain has to be U.S. licensed. There is an exemption for smaller recreational boats that they can be under the direction and control of a foreigner for recreational boats, even though the Freedom is still considered a recreational vessel because of her tonnage over 200 tons. At sea, she has to be under the direction and control of a licensed master. And in order to be a U.S. licensed master, you've got to be a U.S. citizen. So yes and no, I guess. And then the rest of the crew is irrelevant.
This was one of the issues that when we were in D.C. that actually came up, and it was something that the Coast Guard wanted to have a further discussion on when it got into equivalencies because it was outside the whole scope of the Jones Act. So that was an issue that they wanted to have further discussion on as to this equivalency of licensing when it came to the crew and the manning side of it.
Hopefully they will address it because there is a big difference. I mean, he needs to get a master 500-ton license, and that's not easy to do. Typically a 100-ton license is an easier license to get. So, engineering kicks in, and the deckhands, the MMD cards on those kick in. So
They have to all be drug tested. It's a requirement. So you have to be a random drug testing program, which no other flag actually requires, crazily enough.
we might have that exempted.
Oh, that
This
might be the
close.
waiver, Billy.
I think we have time for one more question. I don't want to get in the way of the cocktail hour because people start throwing stuff. So,
You may have answered this already, but can the vessel be chartered or not? Because I thought you said it cannot be used for commercial.
It
type.
cannot.
It cannot be chartered.
Well,
And part of the reason why it can't be chartered, when we filled out the application for inspection, we didn't limit ourselves to 12 persons in addition to the crew. The classic definition of a passenger vessel in SOLAS is any vessel that carries more than 12 passengers. In the U.S., they use a term called passenger and passenger for hire. And the U.S., in general, if you're over 100 tons, which we are, if you carry more than 12 passengers, at least one passenger for hire, you are a passenger vessel. So one of the other opportunities that's left for me to perhaps fight for another owner would be a situation where he might want some charter possibilities, but with 12 or less.
It's a
And,
good, it's a good
Otherwise, you gotta be
question
an
because
inspected vessel for a number of passengers, but that would be something that.
But
would
keep
be-
in mind that the 12 number internationally and in the U.S. is a big threshold, because once you go above 12 and over 100 tons, you're talking about the same regulations that apply to a cruise ship. In Coast Guard speak, that's Subchapter H. One of the thinnest subchapters, but you're really talking about full compliance with SOLAS passenger ship standards. And that's a big issue in yachting in general, because most of these yachts that we deal with, particularly the ones over 500 tons, have SOLAS cargo ship safety construction certificates and cargo ship safety equipment certificates, because SOLAS says any vessel that's not a passenger vessel is a cargo ship.
Thank you.
Yeah.
it
that's-
gets complicated.
that's the
There's
goal.
there's a lot
That's
of
the
work
goal.
still to be done
Yeah.
and a lot of questions to ask off the foundation that they've laid. I just want to thank our three panelists, Drew and Katie and Paul. Thank you very much, and thank you all.